Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're going on a deep dive into Christopher Columbus's Journal of the First Voyage. A book that really kind of lets us experience history firsthand.
Yeah, it's incredible how much we can learn from just this one book. Not just about the voyage itself, but about that whole era.
Exactly. It's easy to forget just how much of a journey into the unknown this really was for Columbus. So before we get into the day-by-day account, what are some of the big themes we see playing out in this book?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's a story of exploration and discovery. Columbus is driven by this desire to find new lands, new resources, and of course that elusive western route to the east.
Yeah, and those desires are fueled by some pretty powerful forces, right? The religion, the ambition, the allure of wealth, it's all kind of intertwined there.
Absolutely. Columbus sees himself as like an instrument of God,
Yeah.
spreading Christianity, bringing glory to Spain, and of course the promise of gold and riches, which was a huge driving force for all European exploration at the time.
Right, but it's not just about Columbus and his ambitions, is it? I mean, his journal also gives us these glimpses into the lives and cultures of the indigenous peoples that he encountered. And we see right away that those encounters are often filled with misunderstanding and tension.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the journal also reveals a lot about just like the practical challenges of seafaring in the 15th century. Imagine navigating this vast ocean with only rudimentary instruments and your knowledge of the stars and winds.
Okay, so let's set sail, shall we? August 3rd, 1492. Columbus sets off from Palos, Spain, with his three ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina.
And it's important to remember this wasn't just like any other voyage. This was a huge leap of faith driven by Columbus's belief that he could actually reach the east by sailing west.
Right, like most people still believe that the Earth was flat. But Columbus was convinced that his calculations were correct. And as they sail further and further into the unknown, he's documenting everything.
Yeah, he's constantly recording the winds, the currents, the birds they see, even the types of seaweed they encounter. It's almost like he's trying to decipher a secret code, using every clue he can find to navigate this uncharted ocean.
And it's not just about practical navigation either. You can sense this real awe and wonder at the natural world. There's this one passage where he describes the beauty of the night sky, saying that the stars shone with a splendor which human eyes had never before beheld.
Yeah, you can really feel his excitement in those early entries. But as the weeks turn into months, the journey starts to take its toll on the crew.
Oh, definitely. The journal captures their anxieties and their doubts. As the voyage stretches on and on with no sign of land, do you imagine being stuck on a ship for weeks? With no way to contact home? No idea when you might see land again.
And you see Columbus really struggling to maintain morale, trying to reassure the men with promises of riches. And by kind of downplaying the distance they've covered, it's a real test of his leadership.
And then on September 15th, they witnessed something that must have both amazed and unsettled them. He describes this marvelous flame of fire falling from the sky.
Wow, can you imagine a meteor streaking across the night sky, illuminating this vast empty ocean?
Yeah, it's like a reminder of these forces beyond their control, the mysteries that lie ahead.
But there's also this growing sense of anticipation. They start seeing signs of land birds, floating vegetation changes in the currents.
And finally, after more than 2 months at sea, the moment arrives.
Yeah.
October 12th, 1492. Land.
The lookout, Rodrigo de Triana, spots land from the Pinta. It's an island in the Bahamas, which Columbus names San Salvador, believing it to be part of the Indies.
He has no idea he stumbled upon a whole new continent.
And his journal entries about those first encounters with the native inhabitants are fascinating.
Yeah, he describes the Arawak people as being naked, generous, seemingly peaceful. They have no weapons, at least none that he recognizes.
And he seems particularly struck by their physical appearance. Their dark skin and hair, their lack of clothing.
He's also really impressed by their skill as navigators. He observes their canoes and how they use the stars and currents to find their way.
But even in these initial encounters, you can sense this kind of cultural disconnect, a clash of worldviews.
Absolutely. And almost immediately, Columbus begins to think about how to convert them to Christianity and how they might serve the Spanish crown.
There's one passage where he writes, "They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want."
Yeah, it's a pretty chilling foreshadowing of the exploitation that would follow. But in these early days, the interactions are mostly peaceful.
He exchanges gifts with the Arawak people, receives food and water from them. He even visits their villages.
He seems genuinely curious about their culture. He He describes their homes, their customs, their use of hammocks, which he finds quite comfortable.
He's fascinated by their use of tobacco, which he's never seen before. He notes how they inhale the smoke through a hollow cane.
Can you imagine Columbus taking his first drag of tobacco, trying to figure out what this strange new ritual is all about?
Yeah, it must have been quite a culture shock, even for someone as seasoned a traveler as Columbus. But he's not just observing, he's also looking for something very specific.
Gold. He's convinced that these islands must be rich in gold, and that finding it will please the Spanish monarchs and secure his own fame and fortune.
He keeps asking the Arawak people about gold, using signs and gestures to try to communicate, and they point him towards other islands, leading him on this kind of treasure hunt through the Caribbean.
So he sets sail again, leaving San Salvador behind and venturing further into this new world, always with that glimmer of gold in his sights.
And this is where, like, the voyage really takes off. He's driven by this quest for gold, exploring one island after another in the Bahamas, each one holding the promise of, like, untold riches.
And he describes each of these islands in such detail in his journal. The lush vegetation, the beautiful beaches, the variety of birds and marine life. It's like reading a travelogue from another world.
Yeah, it's interesting how he's drawn to, like, the beauty of these places, even as he's fixated on finding gold. There's one island he describes as having trees so tall that they seem to reach the sky, and another with water so clear that you can see the bottom at a depth of 6 fathoms.
Yeah, and he even takes the time to admire, like, the native people's craftsmanship. He marvels at their canoes and their skill in fishing and navigation.
But at the same time, he's also making judgments about their culture, often comparing it unfavorably to his own. He comments on their lack of clothing and their simple way of life, seeing it as a sign of their backwardness.
Right. It was a reminder of how deeply ingrained those European ideas of superiority were. Where you just can't see the Arawak people as equals. He views them through the lens of his own cultural biases.
And that bias really shapes his interactions with them. He continues to inquire about gold, believing that they must be hiding vast quantities of it, and he starts to think about how he can exploit their labor for the benefit of Spain.
Yeah, it's a pretty disturbing shift in his thinking. And it really foreshadows the darker side of European colonialism that would soon follow.
But for now, the focus is still on exploration. Following the Arawak people's directions, Columbus sails on to Cuba, which he initially believes to be the mainland of China.
Wow, so his preconceived notions are really shaping his interpretation of what he sees. He's so convinced that he's reached Asia that he tries to fit everything into that framework.
Yeah, he even sends envoys inland, hoping to find the court of the Great Khan, the legendary ruler of the East.
Can you imagine those envoys venturing into this completely unfamiliar territory, trying to communicate with people who speak a language they don't understand, all based on this huge misunderstanding?
It really shows both the ambition and the limitations of Columbus's worldview.
But even with these misinterpretations, his descriptions of Cuba are filled with wonder. He talks about the fertile landscape, the abundance of fruits and vegetables, the strange new animals he encounters, like parrots and iguanas.
He also encounters a new group of indigenous people, the Taino, who live in larger and more complex villages than the Arawak.
And he describes their homes, their religious practices, their elaborate system of agriculture, noting their cultivation of cassava beans and maize.
And he's particularly intrigued by their use of tobacco, observing how they roll the leaves into cigars and smoke them in these elaborate pipes. It's like he's piecing together a puzzle, trying to make sense of this new and fascinating culture.
But his curiosity is always tempered by that search for gold. He keeps asking about it, even offering rewards for information. But his efforts are met with confusion and shrugs.
So frustrated but not deterred, Columbus decides to sail on, leaving Cuba behind and venturing further into the Caribbean Sea.
He lands on Hispaniola, the island we now know as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And it's here that things start to take a pretty dramatic turn.
This is where he encounters Guacanagari, a powerful cacique or chief who rules over a large part of the island. And their meeting is both fascinating and unsettling.
Columbus describes Guacanagari as being tall and dignified with a commanding presence. He's impressed by the cacique's entourage and the respect he commands from his people.
But he's also quick to point out the differences in their cultures. He comments on the Taino people's lack of clothing and their use of body paint, seeing it as a sign of their primitiveness.
Yeah, that same bias we've seen before, that inability to see beyond his own cultural framework.
But despite these differences, the meeting is initially friendly. They exchange gifts, share a meal. Columbus even receives a gold ornament from Guacanagari.
It seems like a moment of genuine connection, a bridge between two very different cultures. But beneath the surface, there's this growing sense of tension.
Some of Columbus's men are becoming restless, eager to find more gold and to assert their dominance over the native people.
And Columbus himself is starting to see the potential for exploiting Hispaniola's resources and its people.
There's one passage where he writes, "This island and all the others are as much yours as Castile," referring to the Spanish kingdom. It's a clear declaration of his intent to claim these lands for Spain, regardless of the wishes of the indigenous inhabitants.
It's a pivotal moment in the voyage, a turning point that sets the stage for the colonization that would follow.
And as if to underscore the fragility of this newfound peace, disaster strikes. On Christmas Day, 1492, the unthinkable happens.
The Santa Maria Columbus's flagship runs aground and sinks.
It's a devastating blow to the expedition, both practically and symbolically. Columbus loses his largest ship, a significant portion of his supplies, and a sense of security.
But even in the face of this setback, he shows remarkable resilience. He uses the salvaged timbers from the Santa Maria to build a fort on Hispaniola, which he names La Navidad, meaning Christmas.
And he makes a fateful decision to leave 39 men behind at La Navidad to establish a settlement. While he returns to Spain with news of his discoveries,
That's a bold move, filled with both hope and risk. He's essentially planting the seeds for a permanent Spanish presence in the Americas, but he's also leaving his men vulnerable in this unfamiliar land.
the fate of those men and the implications of Columbus's decision will become a major focus of his second voyage.
A story for another deep dive, perhaps. But for now, Columbus is focused on returning to Spain, carrying with him the news of his discoveries and the promise of riches yet to be found.
I mean, he's explored this incredible new world. He's encountered new cultures, faced all these challenges. What's going through his mind as he sets sail for home?
Well, you can definitely see this mix of triumph and anxiety in the journal entries. On the one hand, he's eager to get back to Spain and share the news of everything he's found, but he's also a little worried about how that news will be received.
Yeah, I mean, he knows he took a huge risk, and there's no guarantee that the Spanish monarchs will be pleased, especially since he didn't come back with those mountains of gold that he was so sure were out there.
And the return voyage is no picnic either. I mean, they face storms, dwindling supplies, and growing tensions among the crew.
It's a reminder that even though he's achieved this incredible thing, he's still at the mercy of the sea.
Totally, and you can just feel his frustration growing as the journey drags on. He writes about the constant headwinds, the ships, leaking his longing to be back home.
But even with all of that, he never loses sight of what he's accomplished. There's a passage where he writes, "I have discovered a continent, a new world." It's a pretty bold statement, and it shows how much he believes in the importance of this voyage.
Yeah, and he's already thinking about the future, about what this new world means for Spain and for Christianity.
He's envisioning colonies being established, gold and spices flowing back to Europe, native people converting to Christianity. It's a vision that's both ambitious and, knowing what we know now, kind of unsettling.
Yeah, it really lays bare the colonial ambitions that were driving so much of European exploration.
And it foreshadows that, complex and often tragic relationship that develops between Europe and the Americas.
And so finally, after all of that, on March 15th, 1493, Columbus sails back into Palos, Spain, to a hero's welcome.
I mean, he's met with fanfare, presented to the king and queen, showered with honors.
A real moment of triumph. The culmination of years of planning and risk-taking and sheer determination.
But it's also just the beginning of a much bigger story.
So as we close the book on Columbus's Journal of the First Voyage, what are we left with? What does this book teach us about Columbus and about this pivotal moment in history?
Well, on one hand, it's a thrilling adventure story, a testament to human curiosity and ambition and our drive to explore the unknown. It reminds us what's possible when we push beyond the boundaries of the known world.
But it's also a window into a world on the verge of change, a world about to be transformed by globalization and colonialism, and it forces us to think about the legacies of that transformation, both the good and the bad.
Absolutely. I mean, Columbus's voyage opened up new possibilities for trade and cultural exchange and scientific discovery, but it also led to centuries of exploitation and oppression and the destruction of indigenous people.
It's a reminder that history is rarely simple or straightforward. It's full of contradictions and unintended consequences, and perspectives that change over time.
Yeah, and as we look back on Columbus's journey, we have to grapple with those complexities, understand the forces that shaped this moment, and think about how those legacies continue to affect us today.
It's a lot to think about, and that's what we hope you'll do. Take this deep dive as a starting point for your own exploration of history, and keep asking those tough questions. What was driving Columbus? How should we view his legacy, and what can we learn from the past to build a better future?